you're very pro-free speech, pro-capitalism. So given that, it's very interesting that you're also pro-establishment and pro-institutions. So right now, if you look at the world, there's a significant distrust of institutions, at least in sort of public intellectual discourse. What is the nature of your support for government and institutions? Can you make the case for and against them?
Broadly speaking, there is a synergistic effect when two humans come together. If I can speak very broadly in terms of, we'll say, utility, okay? My happiness with one person might be 10. The happiness with another person might be 10. But when they come together, it's like 50 between the two of them. There's like this synergistic effect when humans work together that the sum is greater than all the individual parts or whatever. There's like an emergent thing that happens there.
There's a capacity, there's a possibility of that.
Yeah, a possibility, sure. Things could go really wrong. There could be a cannibalistic tribe that all eats each other, sure. But for the purpose of this,
there's other failure modes, but yes.
Okay, sure, yeah. But I think broadly speaking, are you going to be the actually guy? Okay, if you want to okay.
Well, actually,
sometimes
cannibalism is
there
actually
is
good
war
for
and
both.
Holocausting. True, yeah. Sometimes things do go wrong, but I think broadly speaking, the fact that you're sitting here in clothing that you didn't make, and I'm sitting here on an airplane that I don't know how to fly or build, like, right? There's a lot of cool stuff that happens when people come together and they make civilizations, and part of that civilization building is the fact that we can specialize, and it's the fact that we can offload a bunch of trust onto third parties, that we delegate the power to make important decisions about our lives, right? I don't know anything about how to like build like a combustion engine, but I know that when I push the button on my car, it's going to drive around and the fumes aren't going to kill me, and I can park it in garages and the building's not going to collapse. And the only reason all of this works is because I've offloaded a lot of trust onto these third-party things. And I would say that the pillars of these third-party things that society is built on are, roughly speaking, institutions. So that might be the institution of peer review for scientific articles. It might be the institution of voting for government, right? Or the ability for us to vote in that whole process. It might, all the FDA, like all of these institutions are things that they need to exist because we don't have the time or the capability to individually sort through all of these things individually. We have to rely on some third party to do it.
Okay, so you believe at scale, when we're together, we're greater than the sum of our parts. That's the case for institutions.
Absolutely.
What about the inefficiencies of bureaucracy? Is there some aspect when at scale, different dynamics come into play than they do when there's two people together? Two people that love each other, the birds and the bees. Is there some aspect that leads more to cannibalism at scale? Yeah, so like corruption, inefficiencies that due to bureaucracy and so on.
Bureaucracy, which is not, I hate it when people try to say bureaucracy is government, because bureaucracy exists a ton in private environments as well, right? In businesses and everything. Bureaucracy introduces its own set of problems, but I mean, a bureaucracy is necessary because it's coordinating all of the underlying things in order to create something that's greater than the sum of its parts, right? Like all of the software developers in the world are useless without being paired with good designers in order to make their products usable by a person. And the coordination of those people and the coordination of increasingly more and more things necessitates some level of bureaucracy. I think we always say bureaucracy when it's like it's like a slur almost, like you're a bureaucrat, you're bureaucratic. The bureaucracy is slowing everything down. It's like, sure, the bureaucracy slows things down, but bureaucracy also gives us things like, safe medicine and safe water to drink for most of the US, or safe buildings to live in, or safe cars to drive. So
the managers in institution versus like the software developers and the designers, the managers is the bureaucracy. The reason bureaucracy is used as a slur is that something about human nature leads to bureaucracy often growing indefinitely. Sometimes and becoming less and less efficient without this is where capitalism can come in, that capitalism puts a pressure on the bureaucracy not to grow too much, because you want the bureaucracy to be useful, but not large.
Yeah. And to be a certain size, yeah, of course.
To be the minimum size to get the job done. And so capitalism provides that mechanism. Government does not always. And so that's the criticism of government, of institutions, where it can grow without a significant mechanism that says there's a cost to bureaucracy that's not being accounted for here. We're just paying for the increasing size of government without the benefit.
Yeah, government is a special institution because it doesn't have to show itself to be financially viable. And we kind of live in a capitalist economy where that's generally the case. So government gets its powers from votes from the people, which introduces a whole new set of possible positives and possible negatives, right? Having something, for instance, that gives food or shelter to homeless people, maybe you don't want that to have to run at a profit. But giving, an organization that can self-justify its budgets perpetually and indefinitely growing, maybe that's not the best thing. Yeah, we always have to figure out how to do the constraints there. But
what about the corrupting nature of power? That comes with institutions as well.
Absolutely. So then you better pick your style of institution very carefully. I think that the democratic institution we have in the United States today, I think works very well. But I mean, there are other styles of government that have been tried in the past that I think lend themselves more to corruption. Not to say that, by the way, there's not corruption in the United States. Of course, there's going to be varying levels of corruption at all levels. But you run into this interesting problem where authoritarian regimes can act with ruthless precision and swiftness because they don't have to ask any questions. They just do, and that's it. But the problem is it's an authoritarian regime. They're prone to missteps. They're slow to respond to changing or evolving needs. There was an interesting study that was put out a while ago that showed that like every single famine that happened around the world, almost all, like 98% of them happened under authoritarian regimes where like freedom of speech is very limited. It's very rare for a famine to happen under democracy because press and everything makes the government more responsive to the needs of the people. Power can corrupt. There are levels of corruption, but you have to have like a system of checks and balances on all of those different levels to make sure it doesn't run off the rails, I guess, and do a sick loop-de-loop and, half the population gets...
Nice callback. There's a lot of people that will listen to you say that the democracy in the United States is working pretty damn well, and they will spit out the drink if they're drinking a drink and be very upset. Can you make the case that they're right and you're wrong?
Can I make the case
that
steel man they're right? Yeah. Well, the steel man for them is that people have a lot of problems on the day-to-day. And when they look and they see what government is doing, they might see potholes outside their house, homeless people all over their downtown, and the United States just approved another X billion amount of dollars for Ukraine. Or they might be living in a city where half the factories are shut down, a lot of their people are out of work, but the president is on the TV talking about how to find jobs for immigrants coming in from Mexico. And for these people, they have problems that exist in their lives. Some of them are paying taxes to alleviate these problems. And then when they listen to the government talk, it feels like the government is not responding to the needs that they have. And then that's one problem. Then on top of that, you've got all of these people working in alternative media that can show you, well, look at this politician wasting this much money, or look at him double speaking here or there. Look at Hillary Clinton saying she's got a private position and a public position. Look at how all of these politicians have family members that are getting rich because of their relationships with people in Congress. Look at the revolving door between capitalist companies and the government. How can you look at all of that, take into account that the government's not responding to your needs, and then really feel like it's a government by the people and for the people?
Yeah, this was very good steel man and good question. How can you tell that they're not just politicians that care more about continuously winning the elections versus being running government effectively?
They should care about winning the elections. That's the first misconception. A lot of people say this guy only cares about getting voted in. This guy, he doesn't even believe in fracking or abortion. He just changed his opinion to get voted in. Anytime somebody says that, you should say that's really good. You want them to change their opinion so they get voted in. That's the whole point of a democracy. You don't want them to remain obstinate. You don't want them to say, I'm not changing my opinion no matter what the people want. You want them to evolve and adopt new opinions based on what the population, their constituents are voting for.
Yeah, but the cynical take is that on the surface they're changing their opinion, but that there's a boys club where boys means the elite, that in the smoke-filled rooms, in secret, they actually have their own agenda and they're following that agenda, and they're just saying anything publicly to placate the public based on whatever the new trends are.
So
it's a cynical take of
yeah, I understand. Somebody asked me this question and it flipped. I 180'd completely. I was a Bernie Sanders supporter in 2016, and my single issue voting thing was lobbying. I thought that lobbying, the government was corrupt. They weren't responding to the needs of people. It was completely destroyed my faith in government and everything. And I had one question posed to me by a conservative that used to come on my stream and chat with me. And he said, I think he asked me, can you think of any popular opinion that the American public has that the government is unresponsive to? Is there some big piece of legislation or policy or whatever that people want that the government isn't doing? When he asked me that, I couldn't think of a single good answer. And I'm like, oh, geez.
There's a good answer.
There's
drugs.
There's not.
Legalization of drug. Hold on a second.
Right, yeah, go for it.
All right.
Well, shoot. You're doing the Joe Rogan thing. You're pushing back because I brought up weed. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I have become meme. I don't want to interrupt your
no,
flow,
you're good.
Because there's memes upon memes upon memes I can go with here. But because people bring up, okay, there's no issues that the government is not representing of the public.
So here's the issue. So somebody will bring up like, well, what about the legalization of drugs? Okay. The first issue people have is, one, they look at national polling.
Yeah.
Very few things are decided on a national level. So that's the first huge mistake. Arguably, a lot of BLM made mistakes in this arena where they're saying, like, why isn't the government doing anything about policing? Federal government can't do anything about policing. That's going to be sometimes not even your state government, sometimes your local city government. The people that elect like your chief of police, your police commissioner, that's coming from your mayor, right? So you've got people looking, one, at the wrong parts of the government to even figure out the solution to the problem. Two, oftentimes for polling, the questions are vague enough that you can poll very high, but when you get into the weeds on things, no pun intended, you start to realize like, oh shoot, this is more complicated than I thought. I don't know the numbers in particular for legalization of marijuana, but this is what I'm going to guess is the case. If you poll and you say, should we legalize marijuana? That number might poll at like 65, 70%. But that's including people that are in favor of medical marijuana. If you were to poll like, should we decriminalize recreational use of marijuana, that number might drop to like 52%. And then if you poll like, should we completely legalize, not just decriminalize, but completely legalize recreational use of marijuana, that number might drop to like 40%. There's like all these different ways you can poll around issues where people are like, oh no, we broadly agree on this topic. But when you really figure out, well, do we really agree? Or is there just like broad consensus around a thing that's never going to show up like in a piece of legislation? A really good example, one example I do know was socialized healthcare. I think if you poll, there was a time a few years ago where if you poll America, do you think every American citizen should have access to like free healthcare? I think that polled at like 74% yes. But when you asked, should the government be the sole provider of healthcare, it dropped to like 26%, dropped 50 points. And you could see it was both asking questions about single payer, but the way that it was asked was so different that even if it looks like there's consensus, there's not nearly as much consensus as people think around certain ideas. Yeah, go. We can argue.
You're right. That polls, the way you ask the polls really matters. But when you ask, should the government be in charge of a thing, that also biases the answer, right? Because there's such a negative experience with government creating a .gov site that runs the thing. But sometimes I think if you dig in, if you have a 1 hour conversation with each individual citizen,
sure,
I think you will understand that yes, there is support for socialized medicine. Like it's not
the argument has to be made though. Yeah.
What do you mean the argument has to be made?
Like if you just ask a conservative, like, what about single payer? They're going to tell you no. You might be able to build up to an argument for it, but you're going to have to make the case for it.
I thought we were talking about the feeling deep inside your mind and heart. Does the government represent that?
Oh.
So it's not like some shallow surface layer public opinion. Does the government effectively represent what the people want? Not a shallow survey, but deeply what they want. I'm not actually that familiar with the debates over healthcare, but let's maybe look at an easier one.
Sure.
Maybe you'll say it's harder. War
is a really good example where the government was very responsive, I think, to the people.
You think so? So Iraq, Afghanistan, the government didn't manipulate public opinion.
There's an argument to be made that they did in terms of like WMD and everything, but after 9/11, were you in the United States after 9/11? After 9/11,
that seems accusatory. Like, where were you on 9/11?
Well, just checking, okay.
All right, cool. I have evidence and witnesses. No, okay, all right.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Well, I'm very defensive right now. That's very strange. Look into it, Alex Jones.
But like, I think after 9/11, we could have gone to war with any country in the world. We were ready because all of America was like, oh my God. And they pointed to Iraq and, the reasons for the WMDs was kind of dumb, but I don't think we even needed WMDs to go to Iraq. We could have just said, Saddam Hussein was giving medical aid to Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Iraq, let's go. And we would have gone for it. But post-Iraq, Iraq was for a while popular and then became obviously deeply unpopular, Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think you could see that influence other foreign policy that the United States had. For instance, we opted more towards like drone warfare than troops on the ground for places like Yemen. We opted more towards like kind of like sending money and help instead of boots on the ground for places like Syria. And I think that a lot of that was kind of in response to how unpopular the Iraq stuff it became. And when you looked at a lot of elections afterwards, even for Obama, like one of the defining characteristics of a lot of campaigns were like, I'm going to close Guantanamo Bay. I'm going to get us out of foreign wars. Even up to Trump, I'm not going to stop doing all this weird stuff in the Middle East.
But they didn't still withdraw from Afghanistan.
They didn't withdraw, but they definitely like tapered off and weren't like as aggressively pushing those types of conflicts because they knew it was unpopular.
But I think if you also consider perfect information or good information, if you ask a lot of people, are you okay spending this amount of money for this purpose? So a military conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think almost from the very beginning, they would say no.
After 9/11, I feel like
maybe like a few days after 9/11. Like
I remember Freedom Prize. We were so mad at.
Well, there's some memes and so on, yes, but the nature of the public support for the war. Was there public support in 2003, which is when the invasion happened?
I feel like initially there was a lot. I remember seeing it on, but then I also lived in a Republican household, and I was not very like media savvy at the time. So
I don't know if the nature of that public support had to do with WMDs or with 9/11, because it
became about WMDs.
But I wonder what is if you were to poll people, and let's say hypothetically there was above 50% support for the war, what would be the nature of that support, and to what degree is the government actually representing the will of the people versus some complex mechanism like the military industrial complex is manipulating the narrative that's controlling public opinion. And then there's the media that gets a lot of attention by being divided and how they're shaping the narrative through the mechanism of division. So
there's a lot of complicated things at play.
Yes.
It's not just like the people and then the government. And that's, for sure. I agree that there are going to be different elements at play. But
and how much of those elements that lead us astray can be attributed to the largeness of the different systems. So, and the different institutions, like the media institutions and government, the institutions that have a monopoly on violence. Let's put it this way, which is one way to define government.
Sure. It's complicated. There's definitely going to be different institutions at play. But I think that like, all I would say is like in reference to my original point, when there becomes like broad consensus around a thing, I think the government will usually follow. It's not going to fight. It's going to follow more often than not. But I think that a lot of times I think Americans think that there's more consensus around certain issues than there actually are. So like a really good example, we're on that war point too. What caused like the lowest dip in Biden's approval rating? I'm pretty sure it was right after we pulled out of Afghanistan, which I think if I would have asked people like a year before, like, let's assume that we could pull out of Afghanistan. The government's probably going to collapse after we leave because they just don't have the will to fight. They don't have the support. They don't, whatever. It's just not going to work. But like, no Americans are going to die. There might be a couple other people, but like, no Americans are going to die. We're going to get Afghanistan. Would you support that? I think broadly speaking, I think like more than 60 or 70% of Americans are like, yeah, that would be fine. But then when it actually plays out on TV, when we see the people hanging onto the planes, when we see like helicopter embassy, some of the quotes from politicians, well, now it's like, oh my God, this was horrible. And it was so botched. And it was so like, it could have gone so much better. It's like, well, could it have gone better? Like maybe, maybe not. But I mean, it seems like you can have consensus around a certain opinion, but the way that things play out and the way that people actually feel, it's actually way, way, way more complicated. And there's not usually this broad consensus opinion. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to believe that. I mean, just to lay my cards on the table, I have faith in the power of effective government. I just have a lot of concern about what happens as institutions grow in size.
For sure.
And I just have a lot of worry about the natural corrupting influence on the individuals and on the system as a whole, like the boys club nature of it. I don't know, there must be a better term, but basically they agree to the game and they play the game, and there's a generational aspect, momentum to the game, and they more and more stop being responsive to the people that they represent. I just feel like there is that mechanism. And I think the nice thing, democracy, elections are resistance to that natural human mechanism. Also, the balances of power is a resistance to that mechanism. In some ways, the media that reveals the bullshit of politicians is also a resistance to that mechanism. It's hard to be full of shit as a politician because people will try to catch you on it. So there's a honesty method there that keeps you honest. It's to some degree, but it still feels like politicians are going to politician.
Yeah, they definitely play their games. That is true. But there's probably always going to be that meta narrative over like governance that just develops as like you have to form relationships and play games to like get legislation passed and everything. The only reason why I don't like it when people attack institutions is because one, institutions are incredibly important, arguably paramount. No, they are to keeping society running. And two, I think sometimes when we shift the blame onto institutions too much, I think that we lose sight of what the real problems are. So, for instance, in the United States today, people might be very critical of the government not getting much done, but then everybody turns their eyes to the government for being ineffective. Yeah. But what I would argue is I would say the government is actually incredibly effective and it's showcasing the will of the American people really well right now, which is we are historically more divided than we have ever been. And if I were to just look at the people and I were to say we have a historic divide that is getting like rapidly blown apart by things like the internet and the media, right? If that exists, well, what would I expect that government to look like? I wouldn't expect that government to be governing very effective. I would expect that government to show that legitimate divide in people.
Do you think that divide, we have a perception of a large divide between left and right. Do you think that's a real divide that's in this country?
Narrow the language. What do you mean by real divide?
Do you think there is that divide in ideology, that there's a large number of people that believe a certain set of policies and the different set of policies? Or I think it's just the perception of on Twitter?
No, I think there is a large divide in terms of belief. I don't think there's very much divide between any people in terms of like what they like on the most fundamental levels want in terms of like human beings. But in terms of like Democrat versus Republican right now, I think there is a huge divide in terms of the direction they want to see the country go and what they believe really and what they even believe is reality, right? Unfortunately, that's where we've gotten to.